So let's jump back to significant figures for just a second. There are some rules to determine what significant figures are, which numbers count, and we're going to go through those rules here in just a second. The first rule is really simple. Anything that is not a zero, in other words, counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those numbers always count for significant figures. They are 100% of the time. If it's not a zero, it does count as a significant figure. Zeros are where things tend to get a little bit trickier. There are 3 separate rules for significant zeros. In class, this is the practice problem that we give to help you determine, or to help you to try to find some guesses for what rules count. The highlighted zeros are the ones that are significant. If you want to take a little bit of time to see if you can maybe guess at why the highlighted ones are significant while the other ones that aren't highlighted aren't, you can. But here are the real rules for zeros and significant figures. Like I said earlier, there are 3 rules. The first rule says that leading zeros are never significant. Now, when I say a leading zero, these zeros that I'm talking about are these zeros that come before the very first non-zero number. So I'll say that again. Leading zeros are any zeros, whether it's 1 or 2 or a million, that come before the first thing that is not a zero. So all of these guys right here that I just underlined, those are leading zeros. They never, ever, ever count for significant figure purposes. The second kind of zeros we call sandwiched or trapped zeros, and they are always significant. Now you can recognize a trapped zero or a sandwich zero because they are any number of zeros that are sandwiched or stuck between 2 things that are not zero. So I have a couple of zeros between the 1 and the 7. The 1 is a counting number, the 7 is a counting number. So any zeros stuck between two non-counting numbers, between 2 counting numbers are always significant. Those 2 would always be considered significant. Last but not least, and the most confusing of the 3 rules, trailing zeros only count, so they sometimes count, if there is a written decimal in your number. So using the above example there, if I were to have another couple zeros on the end, a trailing zero is any set of zeros that come after the last non-zero number. So 7 is the last non-zero. Anything that comes after that is considered a trailing zero, and they count if there is a decimal. So using this example, I have a decimal way up here. It doesn't matter where the decimal is. If you have a decimal, a trailing zero or trailing zeros count. Whether there's 1 or 1,000 of them, they count. So in this example here, those guys would count. But maybe here's another example. So maybe that's the number we give you, 700,100. Well, I have no leading zeros. There's no zeros before, so I don't have to worry about those. Here I have another 2 trapped zeros, so those guys definitely count. These last 2 are my trailing zeros. They only count if I have a decimal written. Well, as I've written this, I have no decimal. There's no decimal in that number. So therefore here, they would not count. That's why it's the most confusing rule, because sometimes they count and sometimes they don't. You just have to be careful. So here are all of the class practice problems that we have. We're going to do a few, and then, like normal, pause the video, try to work a few more of them out, and then all of the answers will pop up on the screen. So let's look at number 1, 0.02. You have to identify your zeros first. Before you go start counting, before you make any guesses, first just identify the kinds of zeros that you have. So 0.02. Both of these zeros are considered leading zeros. They are zeros that come before the first thing that isn't 0. And according to our rules, leading zeros never ever count. So we know those guys don't go for significant figures, which means in the number 0.02, there is a single significant digit, 2. It's the only one that counts. It's the only thing there that counts. So let's look at number 2, 0.020. Same idea. Let's identify our zeros. Well, I have 2 leading zeros that come before the first thing that isn't 0. And I have a single trailing 0. The zeros that come after the last thing that isn't 0. So I have 2 leadings and 1 trailing. Well, according to my rules, my leading zeros never count. So those 2 don't count into the total. Trailing zeros count if there is a decimal somewhere in the number. Well, in the number 0.020, there's a decimal, the point, which means in this particular case, that trailing 0 is going to count, which means I have 2 significant digits. Let's jump down a little bit to 5 and 6, because 5 and 6 are pretty interesting. It's the same number, effectively, right? 5,000. The difference between 5 and 6 is in number 5, there's no decimal at the end of that number. In number 6, there's a decimal at the end of that number. So let's look at number 5 first. Let's identify our zeros. Well, I have 3 zeros after the 5, which means they're all trailing zeros. They're all zeros that come after the last non-zero. So we know, according to our rules, rule 3, trailing zeros only count if there is a decimal present and written in that number. Well, in number 5, there's no decimal. There's an imaginary one at the end, but it's not written. So you can't look at it, which means for number 5, those 3 trailing zeros don't count. There is only one significant figure in that number. It's the 5. But let's look at number 6. Same idea. 3 zeros come after the 5. They're all trailing. The rule says trailing zeros only count if there is a decimal written on that number. Well, hey, look, there's a decimal in that number. At the very, very end, it is written, and you can see it. That tells me that in number 6's case, there are 4 significant digits. What you're really saying is that for number 6, you are more confident in those zeros. Those zeros aren't really guesses except for maybe the last one. Whereas with number 5, all of those zeros are basically guesses. Now let's jump across the way for a second and let's look at 14, just because it's got kind of another mix of zeros in there. So 10,810, number 14. So before we can sit there and start counting, let's identify our zeros. I have a single sandwich 0 stuck there between the 1 and the 8, and I have a single trailing 0 because it's the last set of zeros that come after the last non-zero number, come after the 1. So we know, according to our rules, sandwich zeros that stuck between the 1 and the 8, they always count. So you have to include that in your count of significant digits. But with trailing zeros, so now we approved this one, basically. We said that one's good right there. But with the last one, we have to check for a decimal. There's no decimal written. Actually, hang on. Yeah, just want to make sure there was no decimal underneath my writing. There is no decimal written in that number. So that last trailing 0 does not count. The sandwich one will always count, but because there's no decimal, the trailing 0 doesn't count. So for number 14, we'd say it would have 4 significant digits. Go ahead and take a second, pause the video, work through some more of these problems. You don't have to do every single problem, because it's a lot. I know there's 20 problems there. But take some time to go through and see if you can get the number of significant digits. They'll pop up on the screen here in a few seconds. So here are all the completed answers. Hopefully yours more or less match what we have here. If you're still having trouble identifying your zeros, or you don't understand why sometimes a 0 counts if it's trailing, but also others when it does count, or if you're having trouble identifying what zeros you have, please come see us. We're happy to sit there and write any number of problems to kind of help you work through. We will work through them with you to make sure that you understand how to identify number of significant figures. It's going to be really important in the long term. We will continue to check significant figures in basically every unit between now and the end of the year. So please make sure you have a good understanding of significant figures.